So, Dr. Benjamin Zycher ist Senior Fellow am American Enterprise Institute und ist Mitglied des Kuratoriums der Foundation for Research im Bereich der Wirtschaftswissenschaften. Er hat einen Doktortitel in Wirtschaftswissenschaften von der University of California in Los Angeles und einen Master of Public Policy von der University of California, Berkeley. An derselben Universität war er dann auch Professor für Wirtschaftswissenschaften. Entschuldigen Sie. Zycher ist Mitglied des wissenschaftlichen Beirats der vierteljährlich erscheinenden Zeitschrift Regulation. Er ist ehemaliger Mitarbeiter im Intelligence Community Associates Program am Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung beim Nachrichtendienst des Außenministeriums der Vereinigten Staaten. In den ersten beiden Jahren der Reagan-Regierung war Zycher leitender Wirtschaftswissenschaftler mit Zuständigkeit für Energie- und Umweltpolitik im Wirtschaftsrat des Präsidenten. Er ist ebenfalls leitender Wirtschaftswissenschaftler bei der RAND Corporation sowie am Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. So, dann stelle ich euch vor, der Versuch der Klimaalarmisten, eine einfache Nutzen-Kosten-Analyse zu vermeiden. Ein Vortrag von Dr. Benjamin Zycher. Welcome.
Okay, so I want to talk about how the U.S. government, particularly the Biden administration, approaches the benefit-cost issue with respect to its various regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. A bit of history is useful as an introduction. The Obama administration efficiency regulation for medium and heavy trucks. I usually put the term carbon in quotation marks because I think it's political propaganda, and I'll get to why I believe that in a moment. I want to talk about the predicted year 2100 temperature effects of various greenhouse gas policies using the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency climate model, MAGIC 7.0, followed by some summary observations of the costs of greenhouse gas policies, how the U.S. government uses the social cost of carbon or greenhouse gases as a subterfuge, what are the central problems in that concept, the most important of which is artificially low discount rates, which I'll get to. I do want to talk briefly about what the interest of future generations is, or how the right way to think about that. There's enormous confusion in the public discussion about what the interest of future generations is. A bit of an aside about carbon taxes in Europe and EU emissions trading system prices. There is one darkly amusing component of the U.S. government benefit cost analysis with respect to fuel savings, and I want to talk about that a bit and then offer a few conclusions. So in 2015, the Obama administration promulgated a regulation which they called an efficiency rule for medium and heavy trucks. It was an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from, again, medium and heavy trucks. And in that regulation, they, using the EPA climate model, they asserted in the regulation, in the benefit cost analysis that accompanied the regulation, it's called the regulatory impact analysis. They asserted that the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2100 would be reduced because of this regulation by between 1.1 and 1.2 parts per million. They asserted that the regulation would reduce temperatures in the year 2100 by between 26 and 65 ten-thousandths of 1 degree. This is their analysis. This is their analysis. And they asserted that the total reduction in sea level rise, again by the year 2100, would be between 23 and 57 one-thousandths of 1 centimeter. That's what they alleged. And using the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas induced climate change, MAGIC, that's the EPA climate model. It was developed by a guy named Tom Wigley at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I can't quite remember which version of the model. I think it was 5.3. They're now up to version 7. Anyway, 1.1 to 1.2 parts per million, between 26 and 65 10,000ths of 1 degree, between 23 and 57 1,000ths of a centimeter, and then they asserted that those effects would yield net economic benefits of over $100 billion. How is that possible? Well, the answer is really quite simple. They ignore what they claimed were the actual climate effects, and forget whether we believe that or not, but that was what they asserted, and just multiply their asserted reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that would result from the implementation of this rule by the asserted social cost of carbon. That's how they come up with these benefits. The actual climate effects are irrelevant. Now, just as an aside, this is really not all that relevant to what I'm talking about. It's one of my pet peeves. The word carbon is political propaganda. Carbon dioxide is not carbon. It's not a pollutant. A certain minimum atmospheric concentration is about 150 parts per million, according to the literature, is necessary for life itself. You know, water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas in terms of the radiative properties of the troposphere. Why isn't water vapor a pollutant? Is it because ocean evaporation is a natural process? So are volcanic eruptions, which emit, vast quantities of real pollutants, and sometimes water vapor. The eruption of Hunga Tonga in January of 2022, what was there, a 10% increase in stratospheric water vapor in one day, if I recall. I think it's much more rigorous to use the term greenhouse gases, and that's the last I'm going to say about that here. If you apply the EPA climate model, MAGIC 7.0, I do this all the time now, as part of a benefit cost analysis of these policies. And what I've done is I've run these various policies and assume they're achieved by the year 2050, and then I ask the question of this model, what's the temperature reduction by the year 2100? Does everybody understand that conceptual experiment? Under two different assumptions about the equilibrium sensitivity of the climate system, 2.0 degrees centigrade. Even that appears to be too high based on the presentations that we've heard from others yesterday and today. And I almost always use 4.5 degrees as an ECS because when I'm talking to journalists and others, I don't want them to accuse me of stacking the deck in favor of what I'm telling them. 4.5 degrees is the top of the EIKE likely range in the 5th assessment report, and it's above the top of the EIKE likely range in the AR6. Anyway, the entire Biden U.S. net zero policy would reduce, if achieved by the year 2050, in the MAGIC 7.0 model, would reduce global temperatures, assuming an ECS of 4.5 degrees, of about 17/100ths of 1 degree. The Paris Agreement, if you take the national determined contributions seriously, they're not, of course, but if you take them seriously and if you kind of add them all up, it works out to about an 8% reduction in global emissions. The effect of that would be just a bit more than 1/10 of 1 degree by the year 2100. The national, let me just make one side point. The nationally determined contributions are deeply unserious for reasons that go well beyond what's generally recognized. There's no enforcement mechanism, they're voluntary, etc. It's even worse than that, because almost all of the nationally determined contributions are promises to reduce emissions through 2050, typically, relative to a business as usual baseline, right? In other words, a no policy baseline. Well, what's that baseline based on? The business as usual baseline, it's typically based on some assumption about economic growth rates for each of the given economies over the next 2 or 3 decades. Well, suppose that they have overestimated economic growth each year by a very small amount, a tenth or maybe 0.2%. When economic growth by 2050 proves a good deal lower than was forecast or used as an assumption underlying the business as usual baseline, they will have achieved their Paris promise without any change in underlying emissions behavior at all. I mean, that's how absurd the Paris Agreement is. In any event, you get about 1/10 of 1 degree of temperature reduction. If the Chinese were to cut their emissions by 50% by the year 2050, global temperatures would drop by about 18/100ths of 1 degree in this model by the year 2100. A 60% cut by the OECD, about a 1/4 of a degree by the year 2100. Net zero by the entire 27 EU countries, about 9/100ths of 1 degree by the year 20. A global 25% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, you get about 1/3 of a degree in reduced global temperatures by the end of the century. And notice that the standard deviation of the land-ocean temperature record is about 11/100ths of 1 degree. Most of these effects would not be detectable. Even under a one-tailed test, statistical test, even though a two-tailed test, I won't bother you with statistical theory, but in any event, even under a one-tailed test, most of these effects would not be detectable, and certainly not under a two-tailed test. All right, in other words, if you accept the left-wing mindset about greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits of these policies are either undetectable or trivial. That's the central point I'm trying to get here. What about the costs? Well, I don't think any of those policies are plausible politically, for one thing. You know, global GDP fell 3.5% in 2020 due to the COVID economic downturn, and greenhouse gas emissions fell by only about 6.5%. And we're talking, you know, these policies, we're talking 50%, 60% net zero, nothing like, you know, 6% or 7%. I don't think those policies are plausible politically, frankly, and I think we're starting to see that in European elections and elsewhere. You know, I wrote a monograph on the Green New Deal about 3 or 4 years ago, a pretty detailed study, and my really quite conservative estimate of the cost of only part of the electricity portion of the Green New Deal in the US was $500 billion per year, which works out to about $4,000 per year per US household. The European Union reported climate spending in its budget between 2014 and 2020 of about 216 billion euros, or about 31 billion euros per year, and that's almost certainly an underestimate of the economic cost of EU policies. But forget that. The EU greenhouse gas emissions reduction during 2014 to 2021 was about not quite 208 million metric tons, 6.4%. That worked out to something over 1,000 euros per ton. I don't think there's any plausible benefit cost test that these policies can satisfy. That's the point I'm trying to make here. So how does the US EPA and other regulatory agencies get around this problem, that their policies can't be shown But let me back up just a bit. I'll tell you a little story, simultaneously amusing and distressing. I do a lot of print interviews, interviews with print media, just at least one a week, I would say. And I got a call from a young lady, I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, working for E&E News. I don't know if you guys are familiar with E&E News. E&E News is one of the central receiving stations for all the kind of climate alarmism reporting that goes on. It's just a terrible publication. It just is ignorant, and you can't say anything positive about it. So this young lady, she's a reporter for E&E News, and she was perfectly polite and perfectly courteous and perfectly nice, and was talking to me about the cost of renewables and why did I think they were not economic, and et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, I said, well, let me ask you a question, if I may. And sure, go ahead. Have you ever asked any of your interviewees advocating these policies what effect they would have on temperatures by the end of the century? No, I never thought to ask them that. Well, doesn't that seem like a rather obvious question to ask when somebody's advocating spending hundreds of billions of dollars or more on these policies? Well, yeah, I guess I should have asked them that question. That young lady, her name is Maxine Joselo, is now the overall editor for all climate reporting at the Washington Post. I mean, think about that. You know, has she learned anything since she talked to me? Well, maybe, but I doubt if she's learned all that much. It's really quite distressing. All right, anyway, enough of that. So under the Biden administration, I've probably written something approaching 45 comment papers on various regulations being promulgated by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, over the last 2 years, and the Department of Transportation, all these, and the Department of Energy, and all this. And they have stopped reporting what the actual climate effects of their greenhouse gas regulations are likely to be, because they're embarrassing. Instead, they take the asserted greenhouse gas reductions emissions, just like the Obama administration did back in 2015, they multiply it by the asserted social cost of greenhouse gases, right? And then they claim huge benefits, even though that they have the EPA climate model, MAGIC 7.0, and the effects are trivial. And MAGIC, believe it or not, is not all that far from the average of in terms of predictions, from the average of the CMIP5 and CMIP6 models. It's not all that bad, really. I mean, they're all pretty bad, except for, I think it was one of our speakers this morning showed a bunch of the models in terms of that's right, in terms of the asserted or the embedded assumptions about equilibrium climate sensitivity. Did you notice the bottom two, INM CM 4.8 and 5.0? Those are the Russian models. The Russians are doing a better job of getting things right than anybody else. Why is that? Is it because a little bit of warming doesn't sound so bad if you live in Moscow? I'm not sure what's happening there, but anyway, I find that kind of amusing. MAGIC is not all that far from the average of the CMIP 5 and 6 models. So what are the central problems? So they're not really dealing at all with the actual predicted climate effects of these regulations. They're just sort of making numbers up. What are the problems with the social cost of carbon? Well, the first thing is they're almost all driven by RCP 8.5, which is the most extreme of the atmospheric concentration scenarios in the fifth assessment report. The representative concentration pathways are also used in the sixth assessment report, but as Nikolai mentioned, they emphasize the shared socioeconomic pathways, which I think are ridiculous. And Nikolai seems to think that because they're endorsed by economists, I'm joking a little bit, they must have something to them. I'm an economist, trust me, that's not true. So anyway, by RCP 8.5, for those of you unfamiliar with it, under RCP 8.5, atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases between now and the end of the century rise on average by about 12 parts per million every year. That's the average. The average for the period 1985, or no, I'm sorry, for the average for the period 2000 through 2023 was a bit, I think 2.3 parts per million or something like that. So under RCP 8.5, the average increase through the rest of the century is about 5 times higher than the average for 2000 through 2000. It is essentially an impossible scenario. It cannot happen. But that's what they use to derive the social cost of greenhouse gases, and then they use an assumed equilibrium sensitivity to the climate system of 4.5 degrees. And so they incorporate those into models that already overstate the temperature record in the mid-troposphere by a factor of about 2.5 or so. They include asserted effects for the entire globe rather than the US only, even though the rest of the world doesn't have to adhere to US policies, and US policies would have near zero effects anyway. There are just all kinds of problems with the use of global benefits rather than US benefits. The way that the Biden administration has done this, they include the co-benefits of asserted additional reductions of other pollutants, in particular fine particulates, that are already regulated under different provisions of the Clean Air Act. Well, under the Clean Air Act, especially for what are called criteria pollutants, they're the 6 central pollutants, and even for hazardous air pollutants, EPA is required to establish standards for ambient air quality that are too stringent for various technical reasons. And so they're claiming that they're getting additional benefits by reducing the emissions of those pollutants even more, which makes no sense at all because marginal costs have to be greater than marginal benefits. They ignore the benefits of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, planetary greening, a large reduction in net mortality from cold and heat, increased agricultural output, increased water efficiency by plants, and on and on and on. They mischaracterize the future GDP effects. You know, Bill Nordhaus won the Economics Nobel Prize in 2018 because of his DICE, Dynamic Integrated Climate and Economy Integrated Assessment Model. And even there, he asserts that if we did nothing about greenhouse gas emissions, global GDP would be about 3% lower by the end of the century. First of all, that's not statistically significant. It's basically like a one-year serious recession. That's essentially what that is. He won the Nobel Prize in economics precisely because the DICE model doesn't help the environmental left. The environmental left has started, about when he got the Nobel, started attacking him. Michael Mann and Joe Stiglitz and the whole crowd started attacking. I wrote a paper about all the attacks on Nordhaus because his model doesn't support what they want. Yeah, the IPIC 1.5 degree special report that came out in 2018, which I think is the worst work from IPIC, and that's saying something, in many years. Even that report predicted that no change in global greenhouse gas policies would reduce global GDP by 2.6% by the year 2100. And in that report, IPIC assumed that per capita GDP in 2100 globally would be 400% higher than it is now. In other words, people in the year 2100 would not be 400% richer than we are now. They would be only 397.4% richer than we are now. That's basically what they were saying. And again, I think that's what IPIC said in that report, and I think that report is the worst work that they've done in years. All right. Let's see, the most important problem is the use of artificially low discount rates. For those of you unfamiliar with what a discount rate means, we have to have a way of translating future effect, or comparing, I guess, future effects with current effects. In other words, effects during future time periods with effects during the current time period. And the lower the discount rate, the less the future is discounted. The heavier the future weighs at a lower discount rate than a higher discount rate. And so the environmental left, because the effects of these policies aren't going to be seen for decades, if ever, want to use low discount rates because they don't want in a present value calculation to lose those effects. And so the Biden administration, as they calculated their social cost of carbon dioxide at $140, $230, and $380 per metric ton, used discount rates respectively at 2.5%, 2%, and 1.5%. These are all, those dollar figures are all in year 2020 dollars. So these are constant dollars. For the year 2080, their social cost of carbon are 280, 410, and 600 at those discount rates respectively. Those discount rates are preposterously low. How do they justify them analytically? Well, they justify them by claiming that they're engaged in what is called Ramsey discounting. And what that means is that they're claiming that climate policy isn't really an investment shift, it's just a shift of consumption from the current time period into future time periods. That is simply not correct. Climate policy what climate policy means you take scarce resources now that could be invested in automobiles and gas plants and all the rest, and you try to change the aggregate capital stock. In other words, you're going to get rid of natural gas generating plants and replace them with wind farms, or you're going to get rid of fossil fuel automobiles and you replace them with EVs. Those are investment shifts. Those aren't just consumption shifts. They're intended to change the capital stock. And the basic argument from the environmental left is that we can make ourselves wealthier by destroying a significant part of the capital stock, which is just mindless. But that's the argument implicitly that they're making. And they justify this by arguing that this will all generate an increase in consumption, better weather, etc., during future time periods. No, climate policies will have climate effects regardless of whether you think there's a crisis or not. There isn't, of course, but that's a different issue. Climate policies, for the reason, at least in the magic model, will have climate effects that are either trivial or do not differ from zero. And they claim that the present value of all we're going to lose consumption now, but we're going to gain consumption later, and the sum of all those changes is going to be positive. No, the costs are vastly greater than the benefits. That's what that means. The appropriate discount rate is around 7%, because that's the opportunity cost of using investment resources, at least in the US economy, and presumably across the globe in a well-functioning capital market. If you use a 7% discount rate, then the social cost of carbon dioxide would be not $300 a ton or $500 a ton. Instead, it would be $10 a ton. And even that ignores the benefits that I talked about earlier of increased greenhouse gas concentration. There's a different integrated assessment model from Richard Toll, who's an economics professor at one of the Dutch universities. I can't remember which one. He's in England now?
University of Sussex.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. It's the financial something distribution model. I can't remember. In his model, the social cost of CO2 is effectively zero because he includes some of the benefits of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. And in fact, under some assumptions, in the fund integrated assessment model, the social cost of CO2 is negative. In other words, it ought to be subsidized. See, occasionally you will get some of the advocates of these policies to admit that it's not just a consumption shift, it's actually an investment shift. And so they respond by saying, well, the appropriate discount rate is the interest rate on government debt. That is fundamentally wrong. Why? Because the interest rate on government debt reflects the risk that a lender to the government, in other words, someone buying government bonds, the risk that they perceive that they won't be repaid in full in real terms, that the government will find a way to renege, typically by inflating some of the debt away. The government might create an unexpected inflation. The appropriate discount rate for government policies should reflect not that risk, but the risk to the economy that the resources used for the policies might not prove as productive as resources used in the rest of the economy. Again, that opportunity cost is about 7%. Let me talk briefly about the interest of future generations. Future generations, the usual assumption is that future generations want a pristine environment. Or in this context, an environment, they prefer climate phenomena unaffected by anthropogenic influences. And more generally, future generations want an environmental quality unaffected by mankind. That is generally false. That is not correct. What future generations want is a bequest. They want to inherit the most valuable possible capital stock, defined broadly, of which environmental quality is one dimension among many, and there are trade-offs among all of them. I mean, think about a Homo sapiens baby born in a cave, 50,000 years ago. That child will have been born in a world with a virtually with environmental quality untouched by man. Nonetheless, it will have a life expectancy of something like 10 years at birth. What would that child, if you could offer that child better, better food, better water, better housing, better medical care at the cost of some reduction in environmental quality, would that child take it? Of course it would. So in other words, that child, all people, give up some environmental quality in exchange for other things. That child wants to inherit the biggest or most valuable possible capital stock. All of us make that same calculation. And so if we're going to bequeath to the future generations the most valuable possible capital stock, we have to engage in efficient resource allocation now. That's the central point to be observed. So as of a bit more than a year ago, the average carbon tax in Europe for 21 European nations was about 44.5 euros per ton. The low was 75 cents, or 3/4 euro per ton in Ukraine. The high was a bit more than 120 euros per ton in Liechtenstein and Switzerland. Austria was at 32.50, France 44.55, Germany 30 euros, the UK not quite 20.5 euros per ton. If you look at ETS prices, again, as of a bit more than a year ago, in the EU ETS, prices were about a little more than 88 euros per ton. Those numbers, if we abstract from the cost, if we ignore the cost effects of other EU policies, those numbers are lower than the Biden administration's social cost of carbon, of CO2 rather, for 2030. Again, $140, $230, and $380 per metric ton at those discount rates. So Europe, you know, super green, green, ultra green, greener than thou Europe is getting matters less wrong in this context than the Biden administration. I'm proud to be an American. I do want to talk just a bit about one quirk in the American regulatory agencies' benefit cost analyses, these policies. They claim fuel savings. You'll find this rather amusing, I think. They claim fuel savings are a large benefit of policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we force everybody out of fossil fuel autos and force them into EVs, they'll save all this fuel. That's a benefit, right? Well, why do people buy cars that use fuel? Fuel's not cheap. Are they stupid? Well, no. It's because transportation services provided by vehicles that consume fuel yield benefits in the form of the quality of transportation services. They're faster, they hold more, they're more resilient in weather, they're safer, they're easier to refuel. There are all kinds of benefits in terms of the quality attributes of transportation services that fossil fuel vehicles provide. But in the Biden administration benefit cost methodology, and this is the EPA, this is the Department of Energy, it's the Transportation Department, it's across the board. They ignore that. They claim all these fuel savings, and they don't admit that there's going to be a reduction in the quality of transportation services. As Joe Biden would say, the following is not a joke. If they promulgated a regulation that outlawed the use of motorized transport, no fossil fuel autos, no electric vehicles, if they forced everyone back into stagecoaches and horse-drawn carts, I kid you not, this is true, there would be enormous fuel savings, there would be no reduction in the quality of transportation services, net benefits would be enormous. That's their methodology, believe it or not. I mentioned the comment papers I wrote. I found this rather amusing, you may as well. Under an American law, the Administrative Procedure Act, when you write a comment to an agency on a rule that's been proposed, they are required to respond to it. Now, what does respond mean? I mean, they might say, that guy Zycher, who's a right-wing nut, said X, we think he's wrong. Is that a response? I don't know. It depends on which judge you get. In any event, the EPA, I can't remember which of the rules it was, but they played this game and they promulgated, and they did their benefit cost analysis. And I went through it, you know, line by line, pointing out that every component of their benefit cost analysis was flawed analytically. And they claimed this was benefit cost analysis that justified the rule. And so what was their response to me? We aren't required to do benefit cost analysis. That's how they responded, even though they had done that. And it's really quite a distressing game. So that is what I had to say today. Their policies cannot be shown to have any non-trivial climate effects. It ignores those in favor of just multiplying the asserted greenhouse gas reductions and the asserted social cost of greenhouse gases as the benefit. The costs are so big that these policies simply can't satisfy any plausible benefit cost test. The methodologies are really quite bad. In particular, the use of artificially low discount rates. The common argument about the interests of future generations is simply not correct. In at least one important context, the Europeans are getting it better than we are, and the fuel savings benefits are just rather silly. And that's it. Thank you very much indeed.